This train is being robbed. It is the most famous robbery of the 20th century, and the shove it gave to a budding art form has affected all our lives. The train robber throwing the man over the side of the wood car is a small-time vaudeville actor named Max Aronson from Little Rock, Arkansas. The train is roaring over a spur line of the Delaware and Lackawanna Railroad near Paterson, New Jersey. Legend has it that the dummy landed in the path of an oncoming trolley car, nearly wrecking it. The movie was The Great Train Robbery. It was made by the Edison Studios in 1903 and directed by Edwin S. Porter. The Great Train Robbery was an immediate triumph. And because of its success, Aronson decided to become rich by making movies. So he changed his name to G.M. Anderson and became famous as Bronco Billy Anderson. Now this is a picture postcard of Niles, California, a western town just over the hills and a little east of San Francisco Bay. Niles was quiet enough in 1908 when Anderson burst upon the scene. With him was an incredible retinue of actors, cameramen, real cowboys with real guns and a taste for liquor, pretty girls, baseball players, comedians, championship boxers, and almost anyone else who wanted to tag along. For 8 years, Niles reeled, while the S&A Film Manufacturing Company cranked out 1 and 2 reel movies, starring Wallace Beery, True Boardman, Ben Turpin, Shep the Collie, Edna Purviance, Charlie Chaplin, and of course, Bronco Billy himself. By the end of the 19th century, most Americans were convinced that science had reached the ultimate. Man might even fly. In the fall of 1889, one of Thomas Edison's assistants, William Dixon, began to develop the motion picture. By 1893, the doors of hundreds of kinetoscope parlors were thrown open. The American public crowded in to pay a penny to see pictures that actually moved. Sandow, the strong man. Little Egypt, queen of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. This shocking display brought forth the first censorship of the infant medium. Edison saw money in the project when his competition began to project pictures on a screen. He hurried a projector of his own into production. If the peep show kinetoscope was popular, projected films caused sensations. Moviegoers sat and watched anything, just so long as it moved. While films like these were being made by the hundreds, an Edison director, Edwin S. Porter, hired a down-and-out actor named Max Aronson, who recalls,
I went in and they were all sitting around eating. And Porter said, well, young man, what can I do for you? I said, well, you can give me a donut and a cup of coffee. He said, well, sit down and help yourself. He wanted to show the fire department racing down the street. So he said, Anderson, you go down, ask the fire department down the block there, they race down the street. And I said to the captain, I said, will you come out and running down the street? We want to take a picture of it. He said, what do you mean, show them coming out and running down the street? You want to take a picture of it? He said, yeah, we want to take a picture. Show how good the fire department is. He said, get out of here. He said, you know, it costs us $400 every time we take them out. So I went back and I told Porter, I said, set them up, they're coming. And he saw all set up for it, and I went in and I turned the faucet on, and down they come. And the Porter got the picture of it, and it was tremendous. That's the first picture that I made with Edison.
Porter's instinct told him that movies which told stories were better than those that didn't. So he decided to tell a story. This is how it happened.
Well, we were all sitting around there one day, and the pictures were dying out, and the theaters didn't use them anymore as chasers. And he says, I think everything's all through in pictures. And then some chap, he said, you know, Porter, I was in a sketch. We called it The Great Train Robbery. And we afterwards put it in a play. It was so good. And I said to Porter, that's what we should do. Make a picture called The Great Train Robbery. I said, oh, Porter said, no, it would cost too much. I said, find out. Go and see to the powers that be. So he went and he had a talk with Waters. That was the head of the Edison company at the time. Well, he wouldn't do it. He said, it cost too much. And he said, well, how much would it cost? And Porter said, I don't know. He said, you figure out what it'll cost. And the Porter went back and he said, well, it cost about $800. And they finally let us make it. And that's when we went out and we got a company together and went over to New Jersey and made The Great Train Robbery. It wasn't made as a Western. Porter, he says, can you ride, Anderson? I says, ride? I said, I was born on a horse and raised in a saddle. He said, well, then you're one of the robbers. And so when we went out to get the horses at the stable, and I went to mount the horse, some chap says, hey, Bud, he says, don't mount him from that side. I said, what's the difference? He says, you'll find out. So I climbed on the horse, and I hadn't gone 100 feet before he threw me off. And Porter said, I thought you said you could ride, Anderson. I said, well, I did. They said, you were born on a horse. He said, I was born on a horse, not on this horse. So that's when he said, well, you play different parts.
Aronson changed his name to Gilbert M. Anderson and left Edison Studios and went to Chicago. There, he knocked around, making a few films for several companies. Anderson then met George K. Spoor, the proprietor of a vaudeville circuit who rented out films after they had run in his theaters. Together, using the initials of their names, S and A, they formed the S&A Film Manufacturing Company in 1907. Their trademark was the Indian head from the penny, and it became famous all over the world. Anderson, still excited about the idea of the Western setting for his story films, headed for Colorado, and from there to the San Francisco Bay Area. He made a film or two in San Rafael, then, looking for more rugged country, settled in Niles. When S&A set up for business, Niles was a pleasant, quiet place, and it wasn't any small-time hick town either. Here's the main street, the state bank, a good school, industry, a newspaper, and of course, an Odd Fellows Hall. At either end of town, there was lots of open space, and up in the hills, the wilderness of Niles Canyon. Just right for gold mining, stagecoach holdups, claim jumping, posse riding, train robberies, and other Western activities. Imagine the effect of the S&A gang on the town. The fast cars that roared up First Street, dynamite blasts in mine shafts, outlaws' horses thundering past the depot, smoke pots belching in the woods, dummies flung off the barn roofs. Niles loved the movie-making part of it, but after work, the uproar continued. The cowpokes were real, and so was the ammunition they used to shoot out the light bulbs. Posses of cowboys that S&A brought from Colorado and Montana used to gallop the whole length of the town, hollering and shooting it up. They converged on bars and saloons. When they got drunk, they acted just like the cowboys did in the movies, only rougher. Because he never really learned to ride well or shoot, Bronco Billy invented the double. Bronco's riding double was Bill Cato, a tough hombre from Los Banos.
Well, he was just an excellent rider. I used the double for two reasons. The things that I couldn't do, the things that I'm afraid I might get hurt. If I got hurt, then there'd be no more pictures made. Later on, I got to be able to ride. I didn't use many doubles. And
Bill Cato remembers.
But that changing from one horse to the other, if you make a slip, you go under. The only time I was injured was I went over a cliff with a bronc I was breaking for Anderson. I was playing the sheriff, and I think he crowded me off of this new grade. It was soft, and I hit that, and my horse's feet sunk in, and he went over, and he went down about 75 feet, end over end, and me in the saddle. And I wasn't even scratched, but it boogered me up. I was laid up for about 3 weeks on that. But he paid my salary all the time I was gone. He was a fine man for me to work for. I liked him very much.
Billy's shooting double was known only as Texas George. He was just out of camera range in this sequence, doing the shooting. With his 6-gun, George could pick the flies off the lager beer signs in the bar room of the Hotel Wesley. Most of the rowdy element lived at the Wesley. The more sedate and the married folks like the Todds, True Boardman and his wife, and Mr. and Mrs. Ben Turpin lived here at the new Hotel Belvoir. Later, this row of cottages was built on 2nd Street behind the new studios, and the married couples and the nice girls lived there. Bronco Billy, however, lived in splendor in San Francisco. Here he could be close to the bright lights, the fancy restaurants, the elegant chorus girls who were promised starring roles and who accompanied him everywhere. Anderson commuted from the city to the studio at Niles in a white Thomas Flyer touring car, chauffeur-driven. You could hear it coming a half a mile away. When they weren't shooting up the town or racing around in fast cars, the S&A crew hijinked in the streets of Niles. Here is a photo of an impromptu parade gathered at the depot to greet Vic Potel, one of the comedians, as he returned from his honeymoon. The local girls were always being given the rush by the fast-talking actors, or else the town bucks were courting the pretty chorus girls Bronco Billy found in San Francisco. As if things weren't lively enough, Bronco was an avid sports fan and surrounded himself with athletes of all sorts. This unusual snapshot shows some of the lightweight boxers who played bit parts between bouts of boxing and partying. Al Herman, Spider Roach, later boxing coach at the Olympic Club in San Francisco, Red Watson, who ruined a promising career and died a drug addict, and in the center, Pat Rooney, Bronco's chauffeur, who also acted bit parts. Between parties, the boxing matches, the wild rides, girls, baseball games, and just plain hell-raising, the wonder is that so many hundreds of films were made. But they were. Oliver's Barn looked like this in 1907. 2 years later, it had been transformed into the first permanent motion picture studio on the West Coast. The films were developed and edited in a dark room installed in a 70-foot-long Pullman car parked on a freight siding. These temporary facilities were followed by this elaborate studio. Unlike many of the still primitive studios in Chicago and New York, there were Klieg lights, a scene shop, dressing rooms, a projection room, costume and prop rooms. All this months before DeMille made the first feature in Hollywood. Anderson later recalled how the character of Bronco Billy was born.
The Western pictures I made with Seeley didn't catch on, and I realized they should be built around the character. And when I read that story of Bronco Billy and the Baby by Peter B. Kine, I said, that's the trick. Build them around a character called Bronco Billy.
Bronco Billy got his plots from everywhere.
I wrote some of them, and I got them out of magazines. The Argosy magazine was a good Western story magazine. I never paid for any story. I bought the magazine. I tried to get my money back for that, too. They never complained. I just said, take from a story from the Argosy magazine. I gave them some publicity.
The picture that Anderson presented of the West was fair, not too romantic, but not too painfully realistic either. It certainly was not a slick and glamorous West, at any rate. Men schemed and they were weak. Women were preyed upon and needed protecting. Towns were run by rotten government and crooked sheriffs. But Bronco Billy remained true to his code and usually did a good deed or two along the way. This was the first series starring the same character, but each movie was independent of the others. Bronco Billy's fans could never be sure which side of the law he was on, and Billy frequently was in trouble with the law. But one element remained fairly constant. Billy always reformed and frequently got out-and-out salvation. The Bible figures heavily in many of the films. The character of Bronco Billy, as it developed by Anderson, was fascinating in its variety and steadfastness. Bronco could be killed off, married off, disappear over the hills, waving goodbye with his hat, but he would always be back next week, noble as ever, always true. Sometime in late 1912 or early 1913, Anderson wrote, directed, and starred in Why Bronco Billy Left Bear County. With this film, almost everything in the vocabulary of the Western was complete. Unfortunately, this is the only existing print of Bear County, and the crucial scene of the girl giving a Bible to Bronco Billy is missing. But here you can see him walking away thoughtfully, examining his gift. It will figure importantly in the coming action, as it usually did when Billy ran on to a Bible. 1914, Anderson heard about a new comedian who was rapidly becoming popular in a series of Keystone comedies. His name was Charles Chaplin. Spoor had never heard of him, but gave Anderson permission to hire him. Mack Sennett, who had Chaplin under contract, was worried about raids on his star and closed his lot to everyone but regular employees. Anderson, the story goes, put on his cowboy costume, posed as an extra, and talked Chaplin into coming to S&A at the unbelievable salary of $1,250 a week. He turned out to be worth every cent of it. On January 2nd, 1915, S&A announced that it now had the ABCs of entertainment: G.M. Anderson, Francis X. Bushman, and Charlie Chaplin. S&A had hit the top. Chaplin made his first film at the Chicago studios, but Chicago winters and Charlie did not agree, so he left for Niles. Of the 14 films that Chaplin made for S&A, 5 were made at Niles between January and April of 1915. These scenes from A Night Out feature Ben Turpin, brought from Chicago. His magnificently crossed eyes became a landmark in movie comedy. Publicity releases claim that they were insured for $1 million. Insured, that is, against uncrossing. The Champion was started in late February. It used some of Bronco Billy's boxers as extras, and Bronco Billy appeared himself as a member of the ringside crowd. It was his only appearance in a Chaplin film. In all of the transitional S&A films, Chaplin kept inventing new bits of business, new routines, little touches here and there that were to be seen again, polished and flawless in his later films. It was almost as if he were trying his wings there in Niles. Much to Anderson's chagrin, Charlie was the only man in charge of a Chaplin film. He worked in his own manner and handpicked the crew to work with him. Anderson remembered,
I took Charlie back there, you know, to work in the studio in Chicago, but he wouldn't do it. He didn't like to be told what to do. Charlie wanted to think of things and do it himself. And he didn't like the cameraman we had there, and he didn't like the fellow that painted the scenery, he didn't like this and he didn't like that. And so we went on back to Niles. Charlie made his own pictures. He directed them himself, and he conceived them, and he wrote them, and he did everything. It took Charlie about a week to make a film. He was very slow in making. It took me about 3 days to make a one-reeler and about 5 days to make a two-reeler.
In the Park was made in late February at San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. Chaplin never forgot the training that he had in slapstick and visual comedy from Mack Sennett. But new elements began to appear. Satire, irony, unusual in film comedies, became important
They
ingredients.
didn't have these as good actors. They look good. Well, that's what you wanted, pretty, and they photograph well. Purviance didn't do much acting. Charlie just kept her as a sweetheart. He kept her for years.
Edna was just enough bigger than Charlie to set off his slight frame, and her blonde buxomness emphasized his dark, fragile qualities. Chaplin groomed her carefully, taught her to become the perfect foil for his antics. She was always able to react to him with the perfect mixture of surprise and amusement. She never overacted, and she supplied charm and romance to the films. Edna remained with Chaplin for the next 9 years. Together they made 35 films. She never had a contract. At the end of their career together, he rewarded Edna by starring her in his only tragedy, A Woman of Paris. Until her death a few years ago, Edna Purviance remained on Chaplin's pension rolls. Even after his first marriage, their names were often linked together romantically by gossip columnists, and Edna never married. In March, Chaplin started work on the film that is recognized as his first real masterpiece, The Tramp. While at Keystone, Charlie did not have complete freedom to do as he wished. Senate kept control of each film. But with S&A, Chaplin was free to create. The Keystone comedies had been shot in a day or two. The Tramp took 3 weeks to make, an unheard of shooting schedule. Chaplin worked carefully, refining each sequence, in producing a pathos that was completely new to comedy. In this brilliant film, the ideas that had been forming in Charlie's mind crystallized for the first time, and the little tramp, immortal and universal to all men, walked down a dusty road near Niles. This walk became one of the greatest moments in all screen history. If you have lots of cowboy costumes and props and a western street for a setting, and you want to make comedies, the economical result could only be western comedies. These scenes are from Scales of Love. By 1913, S&A was one of the leading motion picture companies in the country. Its studios in Chicago were filled with top stars featured in sophisticated but gripping dramas, set against glittering high society backgrounds. Spoor was anxious for the Niles studios to vary its product, so he asked Anderson to produce some slapstick comedies to compete with the very successful Keystone comedies being made by Senate. The result, 2 series, each featuring a character of Snakeville Slim or Alkali Ike. The comedies have now disappeared, and these scenes are from a rare print, the only one of these films thought still to be in existence. By 1913, it was easy to see that biograph films were different from most others. Most of the audience probably didn't know why. At least they couldn't have told why. The reason, though, was David Wark Griffith. This Griffith Western, The Battle of Elderbush Gulch, is considered his greatest. Griffith had been directing films with intensity, grandeur, poetry, and a mastery of film action like nothing ever seen before. He built suspense by cutting from one piece of action to another. He also used cutting from scene to scene to establish contrasts and frames of reference. He used the flashback. He even spent valuable time and film on shots that simply set atmosphere and mood. He broke scenes into many shots, and a single piece of action might be seen from many points of view. Griffith loved great panoramas of countryside and used them effectively in the few westerns that he made. Watch how he builds almost unbearable tension in the Indian raid sequence from the Battle of Elderbush Gulch. After Griffith, nothing was ever the same. About the time that Bronco Billy was getting a little tired of his western role, a new star appeared. William S. Hart was a cowboy. He could ride magnificently and shoot it out with blazing style. What is most important, he knew the West. He had ridden with trail herds. He knew the misery of frontier towns, the tragedy of casual death. He had slept under the stars, and he had felt the grit of dust on his teeth as he rode across the prairies. William S. Hart was real. The westerns he made were real, too. After his very first film, he was an unmistakable star. Hart wrote and directed his own films, as did Anderson, but there was a vast difference. The Hart westerns had a raw, almost documentary quality about them that was urgent and exciting. All other westerns looked tame and stagey in comparison. Yet there was also poetry and a regard for human emotions and feelings that made the films tender and compassionate. William S. Hart expanded Anderson's idea of the Western cowboy star. Technique and style he derived from Griffith, and with his own sense of the West, created a character and a series of westerns that have never been surpassed. But movie audiences were advancing rapidly. Their taste was being shaped by the work of new film artists, and they were not as content to be entertained by the same old money-making formulas as Bronco Billy thought they should be. Anderson was isolated there in Niles Canyon, apart from the exciting things that were happening to the movies in other places. He continued to turn out one of his westerns each week or so. He was not really a creative artist, but an innovator, even an inventor, a good showman. Basically, he repeated the same formula, the same character, the same situations over and over again, with just enough variation to keep the audiences interested. Anderson, bored by Bronco Billy, tried new characters. He loved playing the role of a gentleman thief, and this film, After Midnight, is one of his forays into that role. It is remarkable for the bold use of dark and light. Drama and suspense depend on the visual elements, the circle of light from the flashlight, the hidden burglar in the dark alcove, illuminated only by shafts of light from the other room. Probably the best film Anderson made in 1915 was a strange combination of the Niles Western and the Chicago high society melodrama. Naked Hands is still a remarkably effective movie. Bronco Billy's wife, Edith, meets wealthy stockbroker Arthur Stanton while Billy works at his gold mine. She is tired of their dreary life, and on the very day that Billy strikes gold, Edith runs away to San Francisco with the evil Stanton. Laden with gifts, Billy rushes home, only to discover his wife has become the mistress of a married man. Bronco Billy lives as a lonely millionaire. Two years later, Stanton, tired of Edith, discards her in favor of a new plaything. Then Bronco Billy meets Stanton unexpectedly. Edith, lost in despair, decides to end her shame with a bullet. Bronco Billy, heartbroken, races to the hospital for a last glimpse of his beloved. In many of his films, Anderson used a child as a catalyst for the resolution of the plot. Rarely was he able to use one, though, with as ironic a twist as he did here. By the fall of 1915, things had changed considerably. But Anderson didn't care if the movies were passing him by. He had a wonderful time in Niles. Some days they worked, and some days they didn't. The local showgirls were very agreeable, and high living was more fun than hard riding. The hot, dusty days of movie making up in the canyon became more difficult to schedule. No one ever knew if Bronco would arrive for work that day or not. In Chicago, Spoor grew concerned. Money was being spent like water out there in Niles, and it wasn't being spent making movies. He sent a manager out to get things back into shape. Cato recalls the day a time clock was installed.
You know, we had to punch a clock. Everybody'd make a dash for that clock, you know. If I'd hit it first, I'd punch for everybody, and if somebody else, they'd punch for everybody. Sometimes we'd miss somebody. Pat Rooney came in that drunk one morning, pulled out his six-shooter and shot it full of holes. We didn't have to punch it for a few days. Gee, we had a hell of a time over there.
At that moment, Charlie Chaplin decided to leave for Hollywood to finish out his contract. Niles was too far away from the bright lights of San Francisco to suit him. When he left, Chaplin took his leading lady, Edna Purviance, his cameraman, Raleigh Totherow, and everyone else at the Niles studio that he liked. George Spoor was stunned. No one at Niles really cared. Chaplin had not been popular, he did not mix with the regulars, and he would not let anyone touch his films, which offended the rest of the crew. When he left Niles, the old devil-may-care attitudes came back, and everyone did as he pleased.
I thought they was a pretty decent sort of a bunch. He used to give a dance there like New Year's or Christmas or some holidays. Well, we'd break in on that and shoot things up. We never did hurt anybody. We'd have probably one drunk once in a while. He'd get drunk and start raising hell, but the rest of the boys would catch him before he'd done any damage and put him to bed or mush him up a little bit and quiet him down, you know.
It was no way to run a movie studio. In February of 1916, a telegram arrived from Chicago ordering the studios closed. Shooting stopped where it was. The film being made was never completed. For a few weeks, everyone hung around, hoping work might resume, but it didn't. Spoor was tired of Anderson's carousing and extravagance. The studios were closed for good. Old-timers in Niles remember the huge studios standing empty all through the 20s. Kids broke into the film vaults and set the reels of highly flammable film on fire. Then they rolled the blazing reels down the street. Windows were smashed, equipment rusted, doors sagged. Bronco Billy was all but forgotten. In the early 30s, the building was sold and demolished. The cottages still stand. For years, you could see the hoofprints of Bronco Billy's horse Pinto in the concrete driveway next to where the studio stood. But now, they are gone too. Of the hundreds of films made by S&A at Niles, less than a dozen remain. In those days, the owners of movie theaters bought the film directly from the company or rented it from a film exchange. Studios did not circulate movie prints or preserve negatives as they do now. When a film had lost its novelty or had been shown in every local theater, the print was thrown away or burned for the chemicals and silver which could be recovered. It is a wonder that any have survived. The Western would have developed if G.M. Anderson had not come along. Other studios made Westerns and they were popular. But Bronco Billy first realized the fantastic attraction that the Western holds for the American public. There is a love of the West in most of us. The sight of a man riding free over the plains, unhampered by the responsibilities most of us have, unworried by our everyday worries, calls out to us. The certain triumph of justice over wrong, the ability of a man to take his own destiny into his own two hands, appeals to our helplessness in a world too complex to comprehend, much less solve its problems with one bold deed. Anderson sensed this. He felt the appeal of the good bad man, the man who drinks red-eye straight in the saloon, but who can be touched by a little child, a man who can read the Bible while waiting to rob the stage, a bad man who will take more guilt onto his shoulders to help the innocent, or to make life better for those whose lives he touches. All of this Anderson put into the character of Bronco Billy and helped in the creation of an American folk hero, the movie Cowboy. In 1958, Hollywood finally remembered the cowboy it had forgotten.
Star of the first Western picture ever made, The Great Train Robbery. And after that, he made over 300 Westerns. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of all the Western stars down through the years, we honor the first man who ever drew an audience by drawing his gun, Bronco Billy Anderson. Bronco Billy?
Want to say something?
Wish you would.
I want to thank everybody that's responsible for giving me this unforgettable award.
G.M. Anderson did not realize at the time, but Bronco Billy was better than he knew. There is still some of him in every cowboy hero that has ever thrilled you by riding across the screen. Brave, alone, and free.